I unfortunately am only now discovering the awesomeness of Dan Barker. This debate with George Pell covers a lot of ground, and I think Dan Barker does a great job of explaining a lot of atheist arguments with an erudition and clarity that I have seldom seen in other presenters. George Pell, on the other hand, seems to be intellectually on par with Peter Hitchens.
For atheists, the universe is the product of blind chance, has no purpose, perhaps just a brute fact. So humans are like the froth on the wave. Sometimes pretty, sometimes dangerous, always inconsequential.
Pell is another one of these guys who seems to think that if a human being's significance is finite, humans therefore are not significant at all. I think people's lives can be immensely consequential. The fact that the consequences of our lives don't endure for an eternity in no way means that our lives are altogether inconsequential. People can have an impact that is significant for centuries or millennia.
Another mystery of life is the origin of the coding and information processes in all life forms. The cell is a system which stores, processes, and replicates information. Flew became a theist, he changed his mind, after studying the directive capacity of DNA, whose genetic message is replicated and transcribed to RNA and into the amino acids, which are then assembled into proteins. How blind and purposeless forces would spontaneously produce such a process is unknown, and I believe unknowable, metaphysically impossible.
Why would it be metaphysically impossible? DNA is simply a pattern. Apologists often talk about information like it is some spooky supernatural entity that can only be encoded into molecules and atoms by a conscious mind. This is bullshit. Information is simply a non-random pattern. If a rock falls into some mud, the shape of the indentation it makes in the mud will contain information about the contour of the rock's surface. The replication of DNA and DNA's role in protein synthesis is a more complex example of essentially the same phenomenon.
So, without God, are we nothing? Let me ask you, atheists and agnostics in the audience, are you nothing? No. Aren't you something? Aren't we biological animals? Don't we come with instincts and drives and even, as George points out, purpose to reproduce, to live, to enjoy life? Are we nothing? Who would dare insult our species by saying that our wonderful, beautiful, learning, imperfect, and yet struggling to improve species is merely nothing?
I don't understand how theists can fail to see how ridiculous it is to think that human beings are inconsequential without God.
There's no evidence for a God. Come on, if there were evidence for a God, we would have heard it tonight. George would have put it on the table and said, here's the evidence for God. Instead, what we heard was evidence for mystery. And George went out of his way to remind us that his arguments are not gods of the gap arguments, but in fact, that's exactly what they are. Here's the mystery. How do you answer it? God did it.
Pell seems to think that his arguments are not God of the Gaps arguments because instead of just saying, we don't know how life began chemically, therefore God, he said, we don't know how life began chemically and I think it's metaphysically impossible, therefore God. This is still an argument from ignorance. Even if it were metaphysically impossible for life to arise chemically, it would not therefore follow that God done it. If Pell can't fathom how life began chemically and he therefore can't believe it, fine. But he seems to think that a disembodied mind created life essentially by magic, which in my view is even harder to fathom and seems to be much more likely to be metaphysically impossible, and therefore I find it harder to believe than the notion of chemical abiogenesis.
And to say that he somehow lives outside of time means that he doesn't exist. To live outside of existence is not to exist. No one has ever properly defined the word spirit, or spiritual, or supernatural. Those are simply words. George, in his works, uses the word beyond and wider. The spiritual word is beyond, it is wider. But what does the word beyond and wide mean? Aren't those dimensional words? Aren't those natural words? Until you theists define properly the words you are using, you may as well just say God is a blah. Because what does the word spirit mean? How do you measure it? How much does it weigh? How much space does it take up? How does the spirit differ from nothing at all? Isn't it just a word?
A problem that is common in theological and apologetic discourse is that a lot of concepts are undefined, or at best are defined by what they are not. They say things like, the spirit is made out of non-physical substance, but if you ask them what the hell that is, they usually only say that it's like the substance that we encounter every day, the substance that makes up rocks and chairs, except it's not that. They'll say that the soul and God don't have any extension or location in space and time. Since that's the case, I've never been able to figure out what it means to say that such things exist at all. What does it mean to say that something exists if it doesn't exist somewhere at some time? They will use words like beyond space-time or sometimes above space-time, but these are spatial designations. I have no clue what these words are supposed to mean if they intend to refer to something that is independent of space-time. What would it even mean for something to be independent of space-time?
So, with God or without God are we nothing? Tell that to those millions of good people who find it is true, there is no purpose of life. Nor should we want there to be a purpose of life. If there is a purpose of life, that cheapens life. That makes us less. It's like the hymn that says, God, you are everything and I am nothing. If there is a God, we are subservient in the universe. We are secondary. We are children. We are slaves. If there is a God, we are truly nothing.
Theists often speak of how they think that the existence of God gives dignity to human life. But how does life become more dignified if its existence is due to and subservient to a creator, especially one who, we are told, created us primarily for his own glorification?